present the Beatles!
The Beatles. Who doesn't know their name, their music? The biggest band in human history, some would say. Made up of 4 boys, all from Liverpool. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. But how did the cultural phenomenon of the Beatles come about? Who was it that found out about them and set them on the path to the big stage? Who was the man who made the Beatles? Brian Epstein was born in Liverpool in 1934 to parents Queenie and Harry Epstein. His parents happened to be wealthy people, owning multiple successful retail shops in Liverpool. Brian was placed in charge of a record shop named Nems, once he had come of age, where he became well known for sourcing and picking out local talent. One day in 1961, a boy entered his Liverpool store and requested an album from a local band named the Beatles, which Brian instantly recognized and pinned to a German label called the Beat Brothers. Unable to find the record in his store, however, Brian decided he would not let the boy go away empty-handed, and so went down to find out when the Beatles would next be playing. It was at a club named the Cavern Club. Brian entered to their lunchtime performance and was instantaneously awestruck by their talent. It was here where he supposedly decided that he would take them on, as he was under the belief they could be bigger than Elvis. He would then seek to become their manager. However, he had never managed a band before, so his parents were adamant, as it would split his time away from their store. He had been through many different endeavours, such as the military and fashion designing, both in which he hadn't particularly excelled at. But Brian was motivated and willing to put it all on the line to make the Beatles big. So he arranged a meeting with them. At that point, the band was not entirely complete. It was only John, Paul, and George. In their meeting, Brian promised a record contract, but also made it clear that if he were to pay for the record, then he would gain some control over how the band looked, as currently they were mainly playing in clubs and wore vastly scruffy clothing and leather jackets. The first order of business for Brian was making them presentable as a group and finding them a new drummer, which would be Ringo. Brian's parents remained skeptical, but allowed him freedom nonetheless due to his overwhelming passion for the Beatles as a group. Brian suited up the band and began to write to multiple record labels. All of them rejected his request for a recording session. Tensions began to rise as, for a moment, Brian began to feel like he may be failing them. He had promised them a session, and he would get them one. During all this, Brian was struggling with his sexuality. Back in the 1960s in Britain, it was actually illegal to be homosexual. It was viewed as a perversion, and that there was something mentally wrong with you if you were having homosexual thoughts. The solution to this at the time was to see a doctor and be medicated for it. So Brian began to take medication in what we would now realize today as an unhealthy amount. Despite everything going on, EMI contacted Brian, stating there had been an oversight in their original rejection letter, saying they would in fact like to have a recording session with the Beatles. From this recording session, the album Please Please Me was recorded and released by Parlophone Records, and soon enough a tour was on the cards. Brian began to up the stakes with the tour happening across the whole of England, as well as parts of Germany, where they had gained a sizable fan base. As the tour went on, the song Love Me Do entered the charts, although at the bottom it was a start. To boost sales, Brian began ordering the managers of his parents' other record stores to begin buying up Beatles albums, even from competing stores. Brian further insisted that thousands of copies of the albums be bought for the NEM stores directly from Parlophone. He continued this for a long time, increasing to numbers exceeding orders of 10,000 records at a time. During this time, he also began selling the rights for Beatles dolls and other merchandising. Before they knew it, Please Please Me had reached number 1. Although Brian had suffered greatly out of his own pocket, he had managed to get them a number 1 hit, and regardless of the people who had doubted him, he had managed to succeed undoubtedly. It was now 1963, and the Beatles began to tour more widely around Europe. The next big move was a push into the largest market, America. Brian had been contacted by a member of the team on The Ed Sullivan Show, which was a big thing back then, a large variety show in America. Millions of Americans would be watching. Brian arranged a meeting with Ed Sullivan where he could discuss the terms of the Beatles' performance on his show. Currently the deal was that they would perform, but not as the headline act, and only for one performance. Brian haggled with Ed, but Ed refused to make them the headline. They weren't a big enough name in America yet, or so he thought. Brian eventually brokered a deal where himself and the Beatles would get paid half for a single performance as the headline, on top of paying for 3 additional shows themselves as the headline. So basically, Brian paid around $50,000 out of his own pocket for the Beatles to headline the Ed Sullivan Show for 3 performances, in hopes it would solidify the Beatles as a name in America. It was also around this time that the current president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated. The world was becoming a dark place, and Brian wanted to lead it into the light. The performances on the Ed Sullivan Show had won the Beatles' favour, but Brian began to become anxious as a lot of the rights he had written away for merchandising weren't returning how he had hoped. A lot of it was tacky and cheaply made. Much of it gave the Beatles a bad image. He began to worry that as the manager of the Beatles he may have done badly by them, all whilst repressing his sexuality. He began to take more and more drugs as a result. Despite this, the Beatles boomed, having a record-breaking 73 million viewers tuning into the show, as well as having their most productive year yet, releasing 9 studio albums throughout 1964.
1, 2, 3, 4!
This happened once before when I came to your door. Well, it took some honey from a
Followed by a similar, successful 1965.
help. I need somebody help, not just anybody.
Come 1966, the Beatles, despite their excessive fame, had begun to get tired of constantly travelling, playing live shows across the entire world, a notable tour being that through Germany, Japan and the Philippines, where it became hard for them to even play at the live shows, due to the music being drowned out by the screaming fans, many of whom were getting injured in the process. During their stay at the Philippines, they further refused an invitation from Imelda Marcos, who was the First Lady at the time. This only made things worse. The band had decided they no longer wanted to play live anymore, as the entire process had become too grueling, where they would be swarmed when leaving the performance space, usually stuffed into the back of a van. It was here when the band began to lose faith in Brian. There had been a string of happenings with the Beatles clashing with religion, and it was topped off by John Lennon's famous quote where he stated that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus Christ, leading to mass amounts of people worldwide to burn en masse Beatles albums. However, Brian managed to convince Lennon to apologise. Even if it may not have been warranted, it stopped the controversy in its tracks for a while. Throughout all this, Brian's health had been worsening. The band had stopped touring, and music production had been greatly lowered. Despite Brian's efforts, the Beatles were beginning to tire, and wanted to reinvent themselves. After the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, in May of 1967, Brian died of an alcohol-induced drug overdose in August of the same year. Brian's story is both a sad and successful one. Despite his own repression of his sexuality and problems with drugs because of it, he still managed to help form and market arguably the most well-known band of all time, proving many wrong who had doubted him before, showing his worth as a manager and his capability to fill the world with love. In this regard, many would consider the Beatles manager, Brian Epstein, to be the fifth.